In my remarks, which I'll get through hopefully rather quickly so we can have a discussion, I'm going to talk about this intersection of science and policy, which happens to be in a town called politics, where it can be rough and tumble. Just to give you a sense where I'm coming from, I grew up in a family of educators. My father's a prominent scientist. I always thought I would be a scientist. When I was going to university, I was a student assistant at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, supporting scientists, and some very prominent scientists, including Ralph Cicerone, who's today the head of the National Academy of Sciences. And I got to listen to them talking about the issues of the day. At that time, it was ozone depletion and the effect of chlorofluorocarbons. And they would say things like, if only those politicians better understood our science, the world would be a much better place. And I thought, aha, I'm going to learn something about policy, get ahead of the game. Somewhere along the way, I had a chance to go to Washington, D.C., work for the House of Representatives Science Committee. And as a very junior level person there, I got to sit around and listen to the top staff talk about issues of the day, Nobel Prize winners who had come in and testified before the committee. And they would say something like, if only these scientists better understood how the political system works, the world would be a much better place. And at that time, I realized there was this I don't know if it's a disconnect, talking past each other, or just a misunderstanding of different roles, but that this intersection of science and policy is where a lot of action is that I decided to spend a career at. So what I'm going to talk about today is how experts might negotiate some of the perils of politics. And to oversimplify the argument I'll present to you today, everyone loves science. There is this notion that you'll see, particularly coming from experts, that there's an anti-science bias of this political party or that political party or these members of the public. But the reality is everyone loves science. Science is broadly viewed as an authority in society. Similarly, no one loves politicians. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but I'll show you some data in a second that may go some way towards supporting that. We know from people who study the role of science in decision-making that science itself is a very poor tool for resolving political disputes. There's often an assumption that people make that if only you understood the facts as I've come to understand the facts, you would then immediately share my values. And of course, setting after setting has been shown values do not derive from facts. Sometimes the causality works the other way. So when we talk about making policy making more science-based, one of the effects is rather than bringing science into politics, making politics more scientific, we see something along the other line of causality taking place. We see politics taking a greater hold in science. What I'm going to focus on is not how policymakers might change their behavior or how the public might become more educated. What I'm going to focus on is what I think the experts have the most control over, which is how they themselves behave and how they organize themselves. So experts have choices in how they relate to decision makers. And I'm going to argue that the most effective way for experts to keep some distance from politics, and this may sound paradoxical, but hopefully will be resolved in a few minutes, is through engagement. So impartiality is gained through engagement, not distance. The role of experts in decision settings, at least one important role, is to empower decision making, not to coerce particular decision outcomes. And I hope that'll make sense by the end of the talk. Now, just some data. This is from the National Science Foundation, was just released 2 weeks ago. It's their latest science and engineering indicators, has a slew of survey data, of information about the state of US science. And what this graph shows is public confidence in different institutions, with the dark blue representing a great deal of confidence. So the most, the institution the US public has the most confidence in is the military at the top. Then medicine, and then the scientific community. You see, I'll just point out, banks are down here, the media is at the bottom, and here's Congress. So while it's not the case that everyone dislikes politicians, the scientific community has a great deal more confidence amongst the public. This is another opinion poll. This is in terms of a profession. So not looking at institutions, but looking at people. What professions do you see as prestigious in the United States? And you'll see, and this poll has been taken routinely since 1977, and scientist is usually very near the top. The only profession that ranks higher in this survey is firefighter. And again, you see member of Congress is down there, not at the bottom, but not nearly at the level of the scientist. ANU here in Australia did a similar survey. This was released in 2010. Thinking about different professions, how much do you think the following contribute to the well-being of our society? Doctors, teachers, and then scientists. And you see politicians far out there on the right. So I would say in terms of public opinion, if you look at Europe, you look at the United States, you look at Australia, you see a very similar pattern, that the scientific community is given a great deal of respect and authority. And of course, that's why everyone loves science. They want to gather up some of that authority and hope it rubs off on their behavior so that they can invoke science to justify whatever course of action they happen to be in. Now, for scientists, this degree of respect, of confidence, is a little bit dangerous because scientists are not immune from the call of politics and sometimes wish to cash in some of that authority themselves. I'll talk a bit more about that. But this data suggests that there's really not an anti-science bias really anywhere. Even if you take a look at the partisan divide, which I'll talk a bit about in the United States, it's not that Republicans don't like science and Democrats do like science. It has much more to do with the political views that are associated with that science. When it comes time to fund R&D or science in the United States, no area has had as strong bipartisan support over time, other than perhaps the Department of Defense. So I'm going to illustrate the challenge with an anecdote told from the standpoint of a little exercise I did on my blog. I run a blog, and it's read by, for better or worse, a pretty large audience, and particularly experts, scientists. And I use Australia as a case study related to climate politics, and I'm going to use this just as an example of the dilemma that experts face in highly politicized contexts. So what I did on this day, this was last July, there was a news article. Julia Gillard was talking about the carbon tax, and what she was saying was that the carbon tax would not threaten coal jobs. And as you probably know, coal is important to the Australian economy. It's also very carbon intensive. So I put this information up. The Prime Minister was saying that this particular mine she was visiting was going to be in operation for 20, 25 years. So what I did is I asked a question on my blog. I said it would be interesting to see how policy experts who know better, and I'll explain what that means, who support the proposed tax, to respond to a question like the following. Is Julia Gillard's commitment to increasing coal production in Australia in the coming decades consistent with efforts to accelerate the decarbonization of the global economy? Now, from a policy perspective, if your goal is to decarbonize the global economy, or a simple mathematical perspective, there's an obvious correct answer to this question, is that it's not consistent to continue to produce coal while at the same time trying to decarbonize. So I said, how experts deal with this question, this situation, in this conflict, makes for an interesting case study in the politics of expertise. Now, I got an email from an Australian expert who probably some of you may know or know of, who wrote in and wrote on my blog and said, overall, I think the straight science, yes or no, just the facts, ma'am, answer to the question must be no. And let the political chips fall where they may. No matter what any expert says or publishes, in such a politically charged atmosphere, it's likely to be seized upon by some political faction or other in support of their ideological agenda. Very brave, strong statement from this expert who said immediately upon writing to me, make sure you don't include my name when you put this up. And the reason for this is clear. There is no positive outcome for the expert in this situation. So on the one hand, if the expert answers that question, if someone asks them, whether it's the media, some obnoxious blogger, an academic, whatever, if they answer the question accurately, then there is no way around it, but they will be seen as giving support to the criticisms levied by Tony Abbott against the proposed carbon tax. They will find their name in the newspaper the next day that says, scientist X says carbon tax isn't consistent with decarbonization. On the other hand, if the scientist supports the claims that are made by the Prime Minister, then that scientist will be giving ammunition to critics by saying something that's fairly obviously incorrect, at least to other experts. So what do? In most cases, you choose to stay silent, or you say, don't publish my name along with that, which itself represents a choice. And I would say that public discourse is made a little bit weaker, a little bit impoverished, because experts feel that they do not have a choice in such situations to play a role in political debates. And again, there is no objective, free of politics way for this situation to be resolved. Now, the situation has gotten to the point where at the intersection of science and politics, a number of scientific organizations have taken on the characteristics of political organizations. And this is some fascinating data. It's from Matt Nisbet, who's a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. And he took an opinion poll that was taken of AAAS members. AAAS is the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They're the largest scientific association in the United States. They also publish the journal Science. So if you're familiar with Science, this is their publisher. And what they did was they asked their members to self-identify in two dimensions. One was a partisan dimension, Republican or Democrat, and this is on the vertical axis, more Republican at the top, more Democrat at the bottom, and also ideologically. So liberal in the US sense, which is to the left, and conservative, which is to the right. Now Matt flipped over this to put all these on one axis. So you have Republican, Democrat, percent self-identifying as Republican, Democrat on the vertical, and the percent identifying as conservative or liberal. And what you see is that the American Association for the Advancement of Science, its membership is more overtly partisan and more overtly ideological than Wall Street Journal readers, certainly much more so than the general public. Here's the CNN, New York Times. Here's the Tea Party out here. Here's the Mormon Church. Here's Fox News. So in a similar poll that was done, U.S. geoscientists, so scientists who study the Earth, the environment, were asked their partisan identification. What political party are they affiliated with? And 6% self-identified as being Republicans, versus the general public, it's somewhere in the area of 30%, 35%. So we have a situation where the views of the scientific community differ dramatically from those of the public. Now, at what point then, when a scientific organization like the AAAS puts out a statement on genetically modified organisms, on nuclear power, on climate change, does that switch over from being perceived as a scientific statement to being a political statement? And again, the difference is important, because the public, they love scientists. I showed you the data, but they don't like politicians. And the threat that I see among expert communities is not that people become anti-science. It's that they view scientists, and in particular scientific organizations, as political organizations. They'll still love science, just say, oh, that's not a scientific statement, that's a political statement. Here's the AAAS. Now, I had a chance from 2005 to 2007 to interview 7 former, and at the time current, Jack Marburger, who's since deceased, science advisors to the president, dating all the way back to John F. Kennedy. And we did public interviews in Boulder. We produced a book out of it. Each one of them wrote about their experiences. And if there was one statement, and I asked them a consistent set of questions to kind of get some data for analysis, if there was one statement that stumped the science advisors, it would be, can you please describe a situation in which you brought scientific information to the president that determined a particular decision? And without fail, Democrat, Republican, the response was, well, science doesn't determine any decisions. We're there to add some support. And in some instances, if we're lucky, we might have some information that is useful. So after the Boxing Day tsunami, Jack Marburger said they did a staff briefing for White House officials on the tsunami. We had more stories of, can you tell us when there was an instance when politics had an impact on science, such as when Richard Nixon's science advisor, Ed David, said that Richard Nixon said he wanted to change the launch dates for Apollo 17 so that it didn't conflict with his re-election prospects. He didn't want a disaster. And he explained that, well, we have things like launch windows in NASA, and Physics determines them, and we can't move them. And guess what happened? The launch got moved to January. And scientists are very fond of saying things that the laws of physics don't bend to the realities of politics. And an important lesson is that sometimes politics wins out, even against the laws of physics. They found another launch window because the politics wasn't going to budge. One thing that these very experienced, knowledgeable science advisors told our audiences over and over again was the importance of recognizing that political decisions will always be political, and if you're lucky, in some cases, science can play a supporting role. So one of the things I've done in my work is to try to help scientists and other experts, and I define experts rather broadly, it might include intelligence analysts, understand the different roles they might play in providing advice to decision makers. And I will tell you my personal self-interest is in the sustainability, the fidelity, the integrity of the advisory process. That authority of the scientific community is a resource, and we tamper with it at some risk to our ability to have that knowledge in the future. There are people, and there's people in Australia and the US who have written on topics like climate change who say, this issue is so important that it trumps the politicization of science. I'm of the view that the long-term sustainability of our scientific infrastructure, whether it's nuclear power, genetically modified foods, pick your favorite topic, trumps any of these issues in particular, and that we really ought to be paying attention. So the advice that I try to give to the scientific community is how to survive in these political environments, not how to capitalize particularly on authority in a certain debate. I'm going to give you a simple framework for understanding these choices. I'm not going to talk about the background, the theoretical development of the framework. I will let you know there is one. It has to do with how we think about science, how we think about democracy, what the proper role of experts happens to be in a democracy. The framework, it's described in my book, The Honest Broker. There's 4 categories, and I'm going to go through each of these in a way that hopefully makes sense. There's the pure scientist, the science arbiter, the issue advocate, and the honest broker. My view very much is that a healthy ecosystem of scientific advice is well populated in all 4 quadrants. We really want expert scientists to be in all of these 4 quadrants. I'll present an argument to you, it's mainly an assertion and we can discuss it, that there's a lot of incentives today that lead to scientists kind of pushing themselves to that upper right quadrant, to become advocates. Partly because the authority of science is so powerful in political debates, and partly because we've asked scientists to become engaged. And many scientists think engagement means telling people to do based on their own political convictions. Now I'm going to illustrate this little 2x2 matrix with an extended analogy answering the question, where should we have dinner? So if you could imagine you're an expert, you're a local expert on restaurants in Sydney. I'm some guy who just flew in from out of town, don't have a clue, and I'm going to role play this with you here in a second, how our interaction might go from the perspective of each of these 4 categories. And one of the things to recognize is that in the context of our interaction, you're only able to take on one role at a time. You can't simultaneously take on multiple roles. So choices have to be made whether we like it or not. So I'll start pure scientist, science arbiter, issue advocate, and then the honest broker. All right, the pure scientist. You may say, I don't want anything to do with your values-based decisions about dinner. And I fortunately went onto the internet and I found the US government provides a document called Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And this document tells you what constitutes a healthy meal. And he said, I found out what constitutes a healthy meal, and I'm going to give you these facts, and those facts are going to empower your decisions. Now, there's a number of reasons you might critique this particular approach. And I should say it's a junior cousin of the old linear model that says if you want to have good societal outcomes, just pour money into basic research, and we get things like medicines and iPads and so on that come out the other end. The idea is that there's this linear relationship of knowledge and action. So we secure agreement on facts, what constitutes a healthy meal. You give that to me, and that empowers me to take policy action. We see this all the time. The debate over climate change, which takes place on weblogs and in newspaper pages, where people argue about the science of climate change without ever once talking about a policy question, is under the presumption that if only my opponents were convinced of the factual correctness of my argument, then they would necessarily be able to take the correct policy action. The dietary guidelines for Americans, interestingly enough, have been studied by social scientists, and it turns out that they're problematic in many respects. Gene Goldberg, the quote at the top from Tufts University, has pointed out to the fact that the same U.S. agency that recommends what you should eat is also responsible for the economic fortunes of the commodity groups produced by U.S. farmers. And she says, the foxes are guarding the hen house. How can the U.S. Department of Agriculture be the lead agency in nutrition education if it's also the organization responsible for protecting the commodity groups? I think it's tough. Marion Nessel has studied food policy for a long time in the U.S. Creating the nutrition guidelines is still political from start to finish. It's science politics, it's politics politics, it's corporate politics. A simple question: should meat be part of my meal tonight in Sydney? That involves ethical questions, and if you go on the internet and you look up food dietary guidelines, you'll find them for vegetarians. That's a question that cannot be answered by science. There are more practical problems with this notion of pure science. It doesn't tell me where any restaurants are. I may have, in my mind, think, all right, this is great dietary guidelines, but it doesn't give me any information about where I would eat. So I'm going to set aside the pure scientists. I do think pure science exists, probably in its pure form. If Bill Gates gave you $1 billion and put you on a desert island with your lab and you cut your internet connection, that's pure science. The minute you're connected to policymaking, it's no longer quote unquote pure. It is contaminated by all the messiness of politics and other realities. All right, so here's the second mode. You could take the role a little bit like that of a concierge at a hotel, where I would come to you and I would say, can you tell me where there are 3 Thai restaurants within walking distance? Or I might say to you, can you recommend a fast food restaurant with a price less than $10 per meal? The point here is that the concierge stands ready to answer empirically based questions that are resolvable on the timescale of your decisions. I don't ask the concierge, what do I feel like tonight? What might I like? You ask the concierge questions to help guide your decision making. And the point there is that it's a structured conversation between a decision maker and then someone with knowledge of the particular decision context. This is probably the most common form of scientific advice. When we have advisory panels for government, they do risk assessments, they do drug safety. Sheila Jasanoff, who's at Harvard, is probably the dean of scholars of science arbitration. And she's looked at this as really a difficult situation to do well. She said the notion that scientific advisors can or do limit themselves to addressing purely scientific issues in particular seems fundamentally misconceived. The advisory process seems increasingly important as a locus for negotiating scientific differences that have political weight. So we put a lot of attention on how we structure science advice. We have conflict of interest regulations. We have procedures to try to balance the bias of committee memberships. We have transparency, we have open records laws, and so on, to try to keep our advisory processes focused on answering the question without undue influences from other outside factors beyond the knowledge. Now, this is also a form of the linear agreement where you secure agreement on facts. And I'll give you an example of how this gets complicated in political process. In the United States, during the Bush administration and now more recently under the Obama administration, there's been political controversy over what's called Plan B, emergency contraception. It's also known as the morning after pill. The question in the US is, should this be available in drugstores to teenagers? And at what age? Should there be an age limit? And what politicians have asked for from the scientific community is some sort of demarcation over when it's safe for teenagers to take this particular drug and when it's unsafe. And it turns out that under the Bush administration, the scientific community said there's no such demarcation. It's just as safe for a 13-year-old girl as it is for a 21-year-old woman. The Bush administration came under great criticism because they said we're going to set the age at 18 years old because it involves parental consent and so on. Turns out the Obama administration, with an election coming up, has found itself facing the same issue. And they decided the issue exactly the same way as the Bush administration did. This is the head of Health and Human Services, and it says that she overrules the Food and Drug Administration on allowing teens access to the morning after pill. What the Food and Drug Administration said was there's no scientific basis for restricting this. And what she said was not, we want to give parents the right to control what medicines their teenage daughters take. What she said is, well, I don't believe the science. I do think it's dangerous because young girls' bodies are different than women's bodies. So rather than saying this is a political decision based on the peculiar politics of abortion and parental rights in the United States, decided to let the scientists take the hit for it. Was played out in the newspapers, a lot of discussion as being anti-science, as showing that there's no respect for the judgment of science, when in reality it's no such thing. The Obama administration loves science. They just happen to like being reelected probably just as much. Now, to try to govern this messy science arbitration process, the U.S. National Research Council, which is a body of the National Academy of Sciences, was asked to provide some guidance on how we put science advisory panels together of experts. One of the recommendations they made, and this was right during the thick of a lot of the controversy under George W. Bush involving science, they said it's inappropriate to ask prospective science advisory panelists to provide non-relevant information, such as voting record, political party affiliation, or position on particular policies. This recommendation came up because the Bush administration would do things such as call up a scientist and say, you know, we'd like you to serve on our committee. And by the way, who did you vote for in the last election? Which was viewed as an attempt to stack advisory committees. It turns out, if you take a look at the committee that made this recommendation, it had 5 preeminent scientists who served Republican administrations and 5 preeminent scientists who served Democratic administrations. Why was there a perfectly partisan balance on this committee? One answer is they got lucky. They just happened to have the numbers work out that way. Another answer is that the people putting the committee together realized it would be more legitimate, authoritative in public discussions if it was not perceived to be biased in one particular direction or another. So the committee that recommended don't pay attention to politics, I would argue there's prima facie evidence that they, in fact, did pay attention to politics in proffering their own advice. And let me say, it's probably good advice to have a balance of perspectives on such a committee. Here's the third category, the issue advocate. For whatever reason, you might like McDonald's. You might think the food is great. You might have stock in the company. You might have a cousin who works there. But you may say, you want to send me to McDonald's for dinner. And you say, here's this map of Sydney with all the McDonald's. You are not lying to me. You're not giving me misinformation. But you are trying to compel a particular decision by giving me certain information. The defining characteristic of an issue advocate is an attempt to limit the scope of choice. And in the extreme, you try to limit the scope of choice to one outcome. So if you're for a candidate, you're trying to get that candidate elected. If you're in support of a particular policy, whether it's to defeat the carbon tax or put it in place, you're trying to have that outcome be the outcome that's realized. Issue advocacy is fundamental to healthy democratic systems, whatever the form of democracy. And it's a noble part of public expression. It is one in which a lot of scientists find themselves getting into some trouble. It's been an issue for a long time. This is Philip Handler, who's the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in the 1970s, who wrote about this same topic. We have learned that the scientist advocate on either side of a politicized debate is likely to be more advocate than scientist, and this has unfavorably altered the public view of both the nature of the scientific endeavor and the personal attributes of scientists. So he says, beware. If you're a scientist and you go out and become a political advocate, you might not be viewed as a scientist anymore. You might be viewed as a politician. And we've seen what that does to your public approval ratings. Now, here's the fourth option. You might say, well, I don't know where you want to go to dinner, but I can give you a travel guide. Here's one I found, Eating and Drinking Sydney, which Unlike the issue advocate, the fundamental characteristic of the honest broker of policy alternatives is to clarify or even expand your scope of choice. So rather than narrow your scope of choice, to expand it, to empower me to make a decision. Let me say that at the limit, if you were to give me a compendium of all of the restaurants in the Sydney metropolitan area, it would be a book this big, and I would starve to death before I study it. So some choices do have to be made. And there's probably no such thing as a true honest broker, but I would submit to you there's something fundamentally different in the act of giving me a travel guide versus giving me a map of where the McDonald's are. In this case, you're empowering me to make a decision. In the other case, you're trying to compel me to make a certain choice. Now, I want to point out that this offers some downside for the expert as well. If you are empowering me to make a decision, you're also giving me the right to make the decision on my own and stepping back from your role in influencing that decision. If you're an issue advocate, you can say, well, at least I tried to get him to go to McDonald's. Wound up going someplace else. You are stepping back from the authority that science grants you to try to influence outcomes. For the politician, the honest broker is not a particularly favorable point of view, because if you, let's say, are concerned about accountability and you need someone to point to as forcing you to make a particular decision, maybe a very tough decision, it sure would be nice to say, well, the expert told me to do it. Don't blame me. I just listened to the expert. The honest brokering role very clearly separates the advisory process from the decision process, with the accountability for decision-making squarely on the shoulders of decision-makers. This, too, has been discussed in the literature. Here's Lord May of Oxford, who, I'm not sure if he still believes this, but at 1990 he wrote, "The role of the scientist is not to determine which risks are worth taking or deciding what choices we should take, but the scientist must be involved in indicating what the possible choices, constraints, and possibilities are. The role of the scientist is not to decide between the possibilities, but to determine what the possibilities are." I would argue that it's this honest brokering role that has suffered, particularly in environmental areas, but other areas of science, as everyone congeals around advocating this or that course of action. Now, we're all familiar, probably, with forms of honest brokers. If you use the travel websites, there's some that are listed here. If you want to know where to go and how to get there, the travel websites, you can plug in Sydney, Denver, Colorado, and I can find all of the options to get from point A to point B, the dates that I could fly, the times, and the cost. They empower me to make a decision about where I want to go and how much I want to spend. If you went to a travel website and you plugged in your information and it said, I can tell you how to get from London to Johannesburg, I'd say, well, that's of no use to me because that's not where I want to go. Expedia, it's a Microsoft company, got into some trouble when they first started their website because people found out they were being paid to prominently feature certain outcomes over others. They were not an honest broker. They were a broker, but they were what you might call a stealth advocate. That gets to this fifth category, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is stealth issue advocacy. Because science has such authority in political debates, it's very tempting for people to say, well, I'm just a pure scientist, or I'm just speaking for the science. I'm not advocating that you do anything, but you're really trying to constrain or compel certain decisions. And it's stealth issue advocacy, I would argue, that really undercuts some of the authority of the scientific community when people engage in debates and they say, I'm only focused on the science, but there's a clear and obvious political or policy outcome that's desired. What suffers, of course, is the honest broker. And the honest broker is a role where you need to have institutions, in particular, willing to step back from the politics of the day and serve that advisory function. Let me just say that the honest broker role is not well served by any individual. We all have our biases, our narrow points of view, our experiences. The honest broker role is best served by authoritative bodies, so governments, associations, that put together committees of experts with a diverse range of perspectives. And in fact, the more diverse, perhaps the better, because that enhances the legitimacy. And what they provide decision makers is not a recommended course of action, but a suite of possible actions along with potential outcomes associated with them to empower the decision maker to take a course of action. The decision maker may say, well, that doesn't tell me anything. I knew what my options are. This is why you need leadership in the scientific community to kind of stand back and say, you know, in some cases, our job is to provide advice, not to tell you what to do. So in conclusion, there's a lot of choices that are faced in how we think about experts, how we marshal experts, how we use them. What orientation do they have to policy? Are they providing, answering questions related to empirical questions that can be resolved by science? Are they expanding choice on decision options? If you're a scientist, you have to decide, what role do you want to play? Is the topic so important to you that you want to be an advocate? And do you want to do so by putting on the jacket that says science and using the authority of science, or do you want to do so by openly being a participant in the political process? Regardless, a choice has to be made. What I would like to see is that experts consciously debate and discuss these choices. Again, are you trying to compel certain decisions or empower decision making? Who are the decision makers? And I think for the scientific community, particularly the Royal Society, the National Academy of Sciences, science associations, and government advisory bodies, how do you avoid stealth issue advocacy, either in practice or the perception? Because that's how scientific organizations lose their legitimacy. If you take a look at George W. Bush's CIA after the weapons of mass destruction issue that didn't really pan out as they had suggested, it really took a change of regime, the new presidency coming in, before the intelligence infrastructure in the United States regained its credibility, because that credibility was used up. Here's how you can reach me, pielke@colorado.edu. I'd welcome feedback, comments. There's a lot of papers related to science advice at sciencepolicy.colorado.edu, and my web blogs, rogerpielkejr.blogspot.com. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes for some questions and discussion. And I can't resist starting it off because Roger and I were talking before the lecture, and he's just about to publish an article on FIFA and the governance of FIFA, and he said because there are some real parallels between the governance of FIFA and the governance of global science institutions. Roger, would you care to expand on that for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that you want to get from any organization is for them to serve the purposes for which they were designed. And if you have, let's say, a scientific advisory body that's supposed to tell you something about drug safety, what you want them to do is answer questions about drug safety. If you learn that that process is somehow contaminated by representatives of pharmaceutical companies, not only do you lose trust in that committee, you lose trust in the entire process. Studying FIFA, which is another global organization that governs global football, is another example where they're supposed to deliver something to a clientele, and the question is, how do we hold them accountable? I will say I have a lot more confidence in the global scientific community than I do the international sporting organizations, but the challenges are very much the same. If you are involved in the international sporting world, there's a lot of temptations out there that involve money, power, influence. If you're involved in providing advice to governments related to science, there's also a lot of temptations out there. Back in the early 1990s when I did my PhD work, one of the things I did was, at the time it was possible to read all of the US congressional hearings on climate change. I don't think it's possible anymore. At the time there's only a few dozen. And there's this remarkable feature that kept coming up over and over in the hearings, is that the scientists go, they testify, they say, the global temperature is doing this and we expect this to happen. The first question invariably out of the mouth of the politicians was, well, what should we do about it? And if you're a scientist, that puts you in a very difficult position. Recall the little thought experiment I did with the coal situation. A proper response might be to say, well, actually, I don't study economics, or I don't study decision making, and that's your problem, thankfully. Many scientists do that. But some scientists say, well, I'm glad you asked, because I think you should do X, Y, or Z. That's a temptation that leads you down that path of the politicization of science, which every scientist in the world is perfectly within their rights to speak as citizens. At the same time, you really want to make sure you have those institutional capabilities to provide good policy advice that is, I think, something different than asking a really smart physicist what you do about economics. In the same way that you want to see other organizations well managed.
I'm Fiona Cunningham from the Lowy Institute. My question just relates to the current controversy that's taking place in the international scientific community about work on the mutation of avian influenza. Are you able to sort of comment in light of your framework on who's playing what roles in that particular issue?
So are you talking about the ability to publish certain results that may be replicable to
yes,
to
yes,
weaponize
and the
or
suppression of that?
Yeah, this is a constant issue that comes up, and the basic issue is that some scientists have done some research on bird flu that the expectation is if their full methodologies were published, then it would be possible for many groups around the world to replicate what they've done and create a potentially very dangerous form of bird flu that could mutate and spread around the world. And the question is, should that research be allowed to be published? This is something that comes up in many different contexts. What if there was a simple way to come up with a nuclear bomb? Should you publish that on the internet? And the point I would make is that that is very much a political decision based on values. There's not a scientific decision. Many of the parties involved in that discussion and that debate reflect the perspectives that you might expect them to. So many scientists will say scientific information needs to be free if we're going to advance knowledge, come what may. There are others, particularly in the international security, defense field, who say, well, actually, we don't think so. We don't want that to be free. The only way that I can see for that sort of an issue to be resolved is through the well-established political processes that we have to resolve all sorts of disputes, which means not everybody's going to be made happy. But there's no scientific answer to that question, I would say.
Sam.
Sam Roggeveen, I'm editor of the Lowy Institute's blog, The Interpreter. As one blogger to another, I wonder, could you say a little bit about your experience in the blogosphere and whether you think it's had any appreciable impact on the science and policy debate, or perhaps more specifically, what impact has blogging and new media had on the climate change debate?
Yeah, first let me say, I think that The Interpreter is one of the best blogs in the world. I mean, I follow a lot of blogs, and it's routinely got great information. So if you don't follow it, you ought to. You know, I'm not sure what I think about the blogosphere. I had a student in 2004 who, for their term project, showed up and said, I'm going to create a weblog on science and technology policy. And I thought that they were using that as an excuse not to do real work. But ever since he's done that, he's gone on to a great career in government, and I've been blogging. I can say one thing, that blogging has certainly had a much greater effect on me and my career than perhaps the other way around. It is a remarkably powerful tool for refining ideas, for collecting intelligence, for making contacts. I get routinely better feedback, critique from ideas, arguments I put out on my blog than I do in the peer-reviewed process. And I think my peer-reviewed papers are that much better. My book, The Climate Fix, is very much a product of the blogosphere, blogging on climate change for a number of years. I would say that overall, blogging has some strong positives and some strong negatives. It does tend to attract the people who are most passionate about particular topics, whatever that topic happens to be, which amplifies the volume of the extreme voices on a particular topic. And you can use that, I think, in a positive or a negative way. I try to use the blog to find, in a political sense, arguments that are compelling to people who I disagree with. And I know not everyone uses the blogosphere for that purpose. Some people use the blogosphere to try to destroy or shout down those who are on the other side. And if you take a look at how climate change is a great example, climate change has evolved. No one wins. It's you know, the shouting can get as loud as you want. And at some point, we have to recognize people have different perspectives, and politics is about finding a way through that. I think if you are able to find high-quality blogs, places around the world and topics you're interested in, you will be far more educated about topics than if you read the any set of newspapers out there in the world, because you have subject matter experts who are in their day-to-day working with these particular topics, engaging on them. It takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but I would say by all means jump in. And I had a student once who told me, I don't read that particular magazine, it was The Economist, because I don't agree with what they write. And Cass Sunstein in the US, who's a legal scholar, he's also in the Obama administration, wrote about one of the perils of the internet is that you can create the daily me, that you can read all day long on the internet and never encounter an idea that challenges your pre-convictions. And I think that's a risk, because that may make people more extreme in their views than they otherwise would. So at this point in time, I'm now working on a book on innovation. I'm blogging about innovation in the same way I did about climate change, and it's proved so far to be a great resource. It's caveat emptor, buyer beware out there on the internet, but it can be an enormously valuable resource.
This leads me to ask a question. Is the game over for science as an objective source of advice? It strikes me that with something like climate change, you can get a great consensus of opinion like the IPCC, but always those who oppose climate change action will always find their own scientists to come back. And it seems to me the average person in the street has no way, doesn't have the scientific training to adjudicate between those two positions, and nor do the policymakers quite often. Have we left a realm where science can be an independent, objective arbiter?
I would say no is the short answer. I mean, it's exceedingly important to understand what experts think, what the diversity of views are, where the balance of opinion lies on a particular topic. It's also important to recognize, I often quote Walter Lippmann, who was the great American political commentator in the early 20th century, who said, the goal of politics is not to get everyone to think alike. The goal of politics is to get people who think differently to act alike. And one of the things I document in the Climate Fix in the United States is that really, there's ups and downs, but political opinion on the science of climate change and the politics of climate change have been more or less steady for 20 years. There's a proportion of people in the United States who don't buy the science, but a majority do. And the numbers are somewhere around 70%, and they fluctuate depending on the weather, depending on political mood of the day, by about 5% plus or minus. If you give me any topic, generic topic, for which there's a 70% public opinion in one direction, I would call that an enormously overwhelming majority on that particular issue. The problem in the climate change debate, as I see it, is that, particularly because it's been led by the science, is that there's some expectation that everyone has to believe the science in some sense in order for the politics to occur. That's that linear model. The reality is that action on energy policy related to climate change will take place because we find policies that meet a wide number of objectives. Some people may come to the issue because they're worried about what the science says. Other people will come to the issue because they think there's opportunities in clean energy. Others will come because they want to give the 1.5 billion people around the world who have no access to electricity cheap, sustainable energy. And there's no reason for all of them to have the same sort of perspective. I think one of the perils that we see is that if we believe that the goal of science is to get everyone to think alike, then we'll see our science advisory bodies sometimes over-egging the pudding, you might say. The IPCC has had some difficulties. In an area that I study, disasters and climate change, the IPCC has gone pretty far out on a limb that was unable to support what it was saying. They lose credibility then. The best that the scientific community can do is what the IPCC has done. Here's where the balance of evidence lies. There's a lot of uncertainties about the future. When you construct policies, that's the reality. And I think from a political standpoint, you just have to accept that people of different political persuasions, outlooks, are going to have different views. That doesn't stop us from making policy on many other areas of society.
Gentleman on the side there.
Roger, thanks. David Adams, I trained as a scientist but drifted across into economics because the money was a great deal better. But I wanted to ask about whether you see there's a role for scientific method in actually studying the way that decisions are made, in looking at the factors that go into it, and being able to assess whether there's actually a consistency in the way that decisions are made. So is there a science of decision making?
Yeah, well, I would say that that's what I do, is a science of decision making, and there's certainly, given certain situations, given certain information, there's better and worse decisions to be made.
Sorry, I thought what I was hearing today was a standing back from the decision making per se, and just an honest broker role where you bought out of the decision. What about a study of the way the decision is made?
Yeah, well, let me be very clear about that. The honest broker is the honest broker of policy alternatives. And so in order to do honest brokering correctly, you're going to be coming up with policy options. And in order to come up with feasible policy options, you're going to have to know something about political constraints, policy constraints, to come up with those policy options. Now, the act of actually making a decision is something different than coming up with options for deciding. So go back to my restaurant example. You're going to have to know something about the restaurant layout of Sydney if you're going to give me a range of options. But when the time comes for someone to say, all right, where are you going to go, then that's on the decision maker. That's what I mean by separating out. If I get food poisoning because I go to the restaurant that was on your list, you're not culpable for that outcome. So I think it's very important to separate out responsibility and authority for decision making from maybe thinking about policy and policy options, which is also very important.
Anthony.
Anthony Zui, University of New South Wales. I was wondering if you could say something about whether your matrix and the sort of issues that influence those in each quadrant apply in the same way to think tanks as opposed to individual scientists or scientific organizations.
Yeah.
Does the matrix look different? Are they playing a different sort of role? How explicit are they about the science and, I suppose, the policy advocacy element within what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. I think it applies exactly as it stands to think tanks. And in the book, I try to characterize, it's not just about scientists, but it's about expertise, people who are representing themselves as experts. I would go so far as to say that the 2x2 matrix applies perfectly well in the context of media, that you can think of journalists in one of those categories. What's the point of a journalist? Are they just to tell you the facts? That's the pure scientists. No, of course they filter it through some perspective. Are they an advocate? Are they supposed to bring you along the path to a particular outcome? Or do they go out and they interview and they say, well, person A said this, person B said that, person C said this? You make up your mind. That'd be the honest brokering. So I think any situation where you have one party who is conveying advice, information to another, and it's a very simplified framework, obviously, but I think you can help that to make sense of the different possible roles you might play.
Last question, just here down the front.
Hi, Alex Carrodus, just a member of the public. As a scientist, how do you deal with the frustration when you've got the facts, you've got a particular view that there's an issue here, and then you've got politicians who are putting forth, policy which is just, in your own view, not the right way to go. Right. That would happen in almost every debate that you have happening now.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing to recognize is that certainly scientists aren't alone in those feelings about politicians. And one of the things I think to keep in mind and always remember about democracies is that democratic systems mean that the people, broadly construed, have every legitimate right to make decisions that would be counter or different or opposed to those that would be made by experts. An example that's often pointed to where there's a huge difference between expert opinion and public opinion is nuclear power. That most experts in the area of nuclear power say it's safe, relatively, it ought to be more widely deployed. And if you go to places like Japan, Germany, Australia, parts of the United States, nuclear power is a public non-starter. Democratic systems have every right to have that approach. I will say there have been a number of scientists, political commentators who have said things like, well, maybe the Chinese system is better because they can just make decisions by fiat. They don't have the messy interference of the public. There are people like the late Stephen Schneider on the issue of climate change who said that climate change is more important than democracy and that we ought to allow scientists to make decisions. John Schellenhuber, a leading German scientist and advisor to Angela Merkel, said that every parliament in the world should have about 10% of its seats set aside to represent future generations, and that those seats should be populated by scientists because they best represent the interests. So the balance between authority and democratic control is one that goes back to Plato, and it's one we struggle with today. And if you have that, and this gets back to where I started, so maybe a good point to end, if you have that authority of science, of expertise, you sure would like to have a larger say than Joe Blow down at the pub in making decisions. For better or worse, democratic systems involve all these people throughout society, and that's the challenge I see in how do we make the best use of experts given the political systems that we have. Thank you all very much.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Love the examples. I hadn't thought of thinking about think tanks in terms of your quadrants, but I'll go back and do some thinking about that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in thanking Roger for this.